There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a house where love was never real. Not the peaceful kind of silence. Not the kind that wraps around you at the end of a long day when everything feels settled and safe. This was the other kind. The kind that hums underneath every conversation, every shared meal, every holiday photograph. The kind that a child feels in her bones long before she has the language to describe it. I felt that silence every single day I lived in the Harmon house. My name is Claire. I was 4 years old when Richard and Diane Harmon brought me home. I don't remember much from before, just fragments really. The smell of something institutional. A window with yellow curtains. A woman with red hair who cried when she said goodbye to me. I never learned her name. I used to think that was the saddest thing about my story. I know better now. The Harmon house was large and well kept, sitting on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where everyone mowed their lawn on Saturday mornings and waved at each other from driveways. From the outside it looked like exactly the kind of place a child should grow up. Good schools nearby. A backyard with a swing set Richard had installed the week before I arrived, or so Diane told people when she wanted to seem warm. She told that story often, at dinner parties and neighborhood gatherings, her voice carrying just the right amount of tenderness. What she never mentioned was that by the time I turned 7, the swing set had been removed to make room for a storage shed. Small things tell you everything if you're paying attention. I spent my entire childhood paying attention. I was the kind of child who watched adults carefully, who noticed the pause before Diane answered a question about me, the way Richard's eyes moved to his wife before he spoke at parent-teacher conferences, as if checking to see what version of our family they were performing that day. I learned early that there were 2 versions of the Harmons, the public one, which was warm and generous and devoted, and the private one, which was something else entirely. They were not violent people. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes when people hear a story like mine they expect something more dramatic in the early years, bruises, locked rooms, obvious cruelty. It wasn't like that. What they gave me was subtler and in some ways harder to name. It was the absence of things. The absence of being chosen. The absence of that specific look a parent gives a child that says, without words, "You are the most important thing in this room." I watched them give that look to each other. I watched Richard rest his hand on Diane's back at parties and lean in close when she laughed. They loved each other, genuinely and completely. But that love was a closed circle, and I was always on the outside of it, pressing my face against the glass. I had one person in that family who made me feel differently. One person who saw me clearly and loved what she saw without condition or calculation. Eleanor Harmon. Richard's mother. My grandmother in every way that actually mattered. Eleanor was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had grown up with very little and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built everything she had with her own 2 hands. She didn't perform warmth the way Diane did. She simply had it. It lived in the way she listened, really listened, leaning slightly forward, her full attention on your face as if nothing in the world was more important than what you were saying. She was the one who came to every school play. The one who called on my birthday before anyone else was awake. The one who taught me to make her mother's bread recipe on rainy Sunday afternoons at her kitchen table. Flour on both our aprons, the smell of something real and good filling the whole house. Once when I was about 12, I asked her why she was so kind to me. I asked it carefully, the way children ask questions they're afraid to hear the answers to. She set down her rolling pin and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly and with complete certainty, "Because you are exactly where you belong. And anyone who can't see that is missing the best part of being in this family." I carried those words with me like something precious for the next 15 years. When Eleanor passed away last spring at the age of 83, the grief I felt was the kind that changes you permanently. Not just the loss of a person but the loss of the one place in that entire family where I had ever been truly warm. Her house sold. Her garden went to someone else. The kitchen where we made bread together became someone else's kitchen. I had to grieve all of it at once. The attorney's call came 10 days after the funeral. His name was Mr. Calder, and he was formal and precise in the way of someone who has delivered important news to grieving families for a long time. He told me that Eleanor's will had been filed and that a formal reading had been scheduled for the following Tuesday morning at 9. He told me my name was specifically listed among the beneficiaries. I hung up the phone and sat completely still for a very long time. Eleanor had remembered me. Of course she had. But hearing it confirmed by a stranger's careful legal voice made something shake loose in my chest. Something between relief and grief and hope that I didn't quite have a word for. Whatever she had left me, I already knew the real gift was the act itself. The deliberate, documented, legally binding statement that I was hers and she was mine and no one could take that back. What I didn't know yet was how far the people in that house would go to make sure I never heard what Eleanor had to say. Mid. I set 3 alarms for the morning of the will reading. I laid out my outfit the night before. A gray blazer, dark trousers, the small gold earrings Eleanor had given me for my 25th birthday. I wanted to look like someone who was ready. Someone who belonged in that room. The night before, I remember standing in the kitchen getting a glass of water around 10 o'clock. The house was quiet. I could see the light on in the garage through the window above the sink. Richard was out there, which wasn't unusual. He spent a lot of evenings in the garage. 30 years in automotive repair had made the space feel like a second home to him, and he tinkered with things out there even in retirement. An old radio, a neighbor's lawnmower engine, whatever needed his hands. I didn't think anything of it. I waved at the garage window out of habit, though I couldn't see if he was looking. Then I went to bed. The next morning everything felt sharp and clear. I was out the door by 8:15, giving myself plenty of time for the 40-minute drive to Mr. Calder's office downtown. The morning air was cool. The street was still quiet. I put my coffee in the cup holder, backed out of the driveway and turned toward the main road. Within 3 minutes something was wrong. The car was pulling hard to the left. Not the gentle drift of an uneven road but something insistent, something deliberate. I corrected the wheel and it pulled again. By the time I reached the edge of the neighborhood I could hear it too. A low grinding sound from the front left corner of the vehicle, rhythmic and getting worse. My hands tightened on the wheel. My chest tightened with them. I pulled over into the parking lot of a closed hardware store and sat there with the engine running, telling myself to stay calm, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself I still had time. I called roadside assistance. They told me 45 minutes minimum. I called Mr. Calder's office. His assistant answered, professional and polite, and told me the reading would proceed as scheduled but that my absence would be noted. I asked if there was any flexibility. She put me on hold for 2 minutes. When she came back, she said Mr. Calder was sorry but the other parties were already present and waiting. The other parties? Richard and Diane, sitting in that office already in their good clothes, with their folded hands and their public faces, waiting to find out what Eleanor had decided. I sat in that parking lot for 47 minutes while the tow truck came. I watched the morning go past. I watched other people drive to their ordinary destinations without anything in their way. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not the dull ache of being overlooked that I had grown up with, but something sharper and more specific. Something that was already starting to ask questions. The mechanic who towed my car was a man named Dale. He ran a small shop about 2 miles from the hardware store, and he had the unhurried manner of someone who has never needed to perform confidence because the real thing came naturally. He called me the next morning, and his voice when he spoke was careful, the voice of someone choosing their words. He told me the lug nuts on my front left wheel had been loosened. Not one of them, 3 of them on the same wheel, reduced to less than half their proper torque. He told me this was not wear and tear, not road vibration, not any kind of gradual failure. He had been doing this work for 31 years, he said, and he knew the difference between a wheel that had come loose on its own and a wheel that had been helped along by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who knew what they were doing. I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a very long time. Richard had spent 3 decades in automotive repair. He had rebuilt engines in that garage. He had taught himself everything about every system in every vehicle our family had ever owned. He knew exactly what loosening 3 lug nuts on a front wheel would do to a car at highway speed. He knew what road I would take to Mr. Calder's office. He knew the stretch of that road where the speed limit went up and the traffic moved fast. He had stood in that garage the night before in the dark with the light on while I waved at the window. The full understanding of it didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers, each one heavier than the last. First the mechanical fact of what had been done, then the intention behind it, then the calculation, the cold, deliberate calculation of a man who had looked at his own daughter, the child he had agreed to raise and protect and love, and decided that what she might inherit was worth more than her safety on the road. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, I didn't collapse, didn't cry. I just sat down slowly because standing suddenly required more effort than I had available. And I thought about every dinner I had ever eaten at that table. Every Christmas morning. Every time I had told myself the distance I felt from them was something I had imagined, something I could fix if I just tried harder, loved better, made myself easier to keep. I had not imagined it. I had never needed to fix anything. The only thing that had ever been broken in that house was them. I called Mr. Calder's office the following morning. I explained what had happened, not emotionally but factually, the way Eleanor had taught me to handle difficult things. I told him about the car, about Dale's findings, about the timing. Mr. Calder listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me something that made Eleanor feel close again, even through the phone line. He told me that Eleanor had included a specific provision in her will, a clause that addressed the possibility of a named beneficiary being prevented from attending the reading by circumstances outside their control. The clause was detailed, he said, and deliberate. It had clearly been written with care. It allowed for a private follow-up meeting with any such beneficiary, carrying the full legal weight of the original proceedings. Eleanor had known. She had sat with her attorney, this careful, formal man, and she had thought about what her son might do, and she had built a door in the wall before he even had the chance to lock it. She had protected me one last time from a place I couldn't reach. Mr. Calder scheduled our meeting for the following Thursday. I told no one. I came home to the Harmon house that evening and I made dinner and I set the table and I passed the bread when Richard reached for it. I looked at Diane's face when she thought I wasn't watching. She looked satisfied in the quiet, restrained way of someone who believes they have solved a problem. She had no idea. I lay awake that night and I thought about who I had been in that house. The girl who made herself small, who swallowed her feelings, who chose peace over truth because the cost of truth had always seemed too high. I thought about how many years I had given to people who had been calculating against me the whole time. And somewhere in the middle of that long dark night, something in me finished grieving and started becoming something else entirely. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been too simple, too hot, too easily spent. What I felt was colder and cleaner than anger. It was clarity. It was the specific stillness of a person who has finally stopped hoping for something that was never going to come and started dealing with what is actually true. I was done being their daughter. I had never actually been their daughter. And I was done pretending otherwise. Thursday morning I drove a rental car to Mr. Calder's office. I wore the same gray blazer, the same gold earrings. I was 12 minutes early and I sat in the waiting area with my hands folded in my lap and I breathed slowly and I thought about Eleanor on her porch at the lake house, watching the water, the way she always turned to look at me and smiled like I was the best part of what she was seeing. Mr. Calder closed the office door and sat across from me and opened the folder on his desk. Eleanor had left me the lake house. It was a property that had been in the Harmon family for 3 generations. A cedar-sided house on a quiet lake about an hour from the city, with a long wooden porch and a dock that needed repainting and pine trees that came all the way down to the water's edge. I had spent every summer of my childhood there, or at least the summers before Richard and Diane found reasons to stop going. It was where Eleanor and I had sat together in the early mornings while everyone else was still sleeping, watching mist come off the water, not talking much because we didn't need to. It was the most peaceful place I had ever been in my life, and it had always felt more like home than any house I had actually lived in. Eleanor had valued it at $430,000. She had left it to me entirely, with no conditions and no shared ownership. She had also left a personal letter, which Mr. Calder read aloud in his careful, measured voice while I sat across from him and kept my breathing steady. In the letter, Eleanor said she had watched me my entire life. She said she saw the effort I made every day in that family. The grace I showed when grace was not returned. The love I offered to people who didn't know how to receive it. She said she was sorry she hadn't done more sooner. She said the lake house was mine because in all the years the family had owned it she had never seen anyone love it the way I did. Had never seen anyone sit still enough on that porch to actually hear what the water was saying. She said, "You were never a guest in this family, Claire. You were always the heart of it. Some people were simply too afraid of their own smallness to admit what you were." Mr. Calder finished reading and looked up at me. I pressed both palms flat on the desk. I breathed in once slowly. I did not cry in that office, though I came very close. What I felt was beyond crying. It was the full weight of being seen by someone who was no longer there to see me, and the strange fierce gratitude of knowing that her seeing me had mattered enough to outlast her. When Richard and Diane found out, the reaction was everything I had expected and worse. Richard's face went the color of old ash. Diane made a series of phone calls in a voice stripped of every performance, every careful warmth, every layer of the person she had spent decades presenting to the world. She was on the phone with a family attorney within the hour, her voice sharp and stripped and furious in a way I had never heard before. There were threats of a legal challenge. There were accusations about Eleanor's mental state, about undue influence, about procedural irregularities in the will. There were ugly words spoken in rooms I wasn't present in, reported back to me by a cousin who had always quietly been on my side. Richard told someone I had manipulated his mother. He said it loudly and he said it often. None of it changed anything. Dale's written report about the lug nuts went to Mr. Calder, who had already anticipated the possibility of a challenge and had prepared accordingly. Eleanor's mental state at the time the will was drafted was documented thoroughly. She had been assessed by her physician twice in the 18 months before her death, at her own request, and both assessments confirmed her full cognitive clarity. The clause she had insisted on inserting, the one that had allowed me to attend a private follow-up reading, had been written specifically and deliberately, a fact that spoke to the precise, protective intelligence of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing and exactly who she was protecting. The legal challenge went nowhere. It dissolved within 3 weeks, quietly and without ceremony, the way things do when the truth has already been fully documented and there is nothing left to argue. I never moved back into the Harmon house. I stayed in a short-term rental while everything was finalized, and then on a Saturday in early October I drove out to the lake house alone with the key Mr. Calder had given me, and I unlocked the front door for the first time as its owner. The air inside was still and cool, the way houses get when they've been closed up for a season. Dust on the surfaces, afternoon light coming in low and gold through the windows at the back. I walked through every room slowly. The kitchen with its old wooden counters and the window above the sink that looked out toward the water. The narrow back hallway where Eleanor had hung family photographs. And there, among them, one of me, 8 years old, at the end of the dock looking back at the camera, squinting into the sun. Someone had loved me enough to frame it and hang it on the wall that I stood there for a long time looking at that photograph. Then I went out to the porch and I sat down in the old wooden chair closest to the railing and I looked at the lake. The water was gray and silver in the October afternoon, the pine trees perfectly still on the far bank, the whole world quiet in the particular way of places that have learned to be patient. I thought about Richard in that garage. I thought about Diane's smile in the living room. I thought about every year I had spent trying to earn something that was never going to be given, not because I wasn't worthy of it but because they were not capable of giving it. There is a difference. It took me a long time to understand that the failure was never mine. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the way she had held my hand at Christmas, the flower on her apron, the letter in Mr. Calder's steady voice. I thought about what it means to be truly loved by even one person, how it is enough, how it is more than enough, how it can hold you up across years and distance and even death if it was real enough when it was given. The people who try to take from you, who work in the dark to clear you out of your own life, they are always underneath everything afraid. Afraid of what you are. Afraid of what you might become if someone finally tells you the truth about your own worth. They loosen the bolts because they cannot bear to see you arrive. But Eleanor built the door before they could lock it. And I arrived anyway. I still go to the lake house every chance I get. I have repainted the dock. I have planted things in the garden. I have sat on that porch in every kind of weather. In spring rain and summer heat and the kind of cold clear winter mornings where the lake is perfectly flat and the whole world looks like it has been washed clean overnight. And sometimes in the quietest part of those mornings, when the mist is still on the water and the light is just beginning to come through the trees, I feel it, that specific warmth, that full and unhurried attention, that sense of being exactly where I am supposed to be and known completely by someone who loved me first and longest and best. I don't need it confirmed anymore. I don't need anyone's approval or acknowledgement or carefully performed affection. Eleanor saw me. She wrote it down. She made it permanent. And in the end, her love was the only thing that was ever worth having. That turned out to be more than enough to build a whole life on.